mentioned, I'm Marianne from the Public School Forum of North Carolina, and we focus on providing evidence-based research, policy analysis, and innovative programs to make sure that we are empowering our public to have an effective education for all of our students in North Carolina. And so I'm delighted to share to start this presentation with you. So with that, I will turn it over to Elizabeth DeConti.
Thanks, Marianne, and hi, everyone. We are excited to be here with so many of you today and talk about this really important topic. So this slide gives just a quick overview of our presentation today. So we're going to start by giving some of the data and research around adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with that term and some of the research there, and talking a little bit about systemic racism and the link between those two areas. Then we'll go into the impact on our students at an individual level as well as our schools as a whole. And then I'm going to turn it over to Christy and Shanda and our team, who are going to talk more about where do we start and what can we do to help create change with these issues. So they'll share a little bit about what this process can look like, some strategies to consider, some specific school examples that we've done some work with, and we'll wrap up at the end with Marianne giving a few policy recommendations from our team. So ACEs, again, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this term and this research study, but ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and this originated from a study done back in the 90s in Southern California, led by the CDC and an insurance company there. And they included over 17,000 participants in this study. And it's important to note that the majority of those participants were privately insured, middle to upper class, college educated. And what they did was they created what was called the ACE questionnaire, which included 10 questions about 10 different types of adverse childhood experiences that someone may have experienced as a child. And some of those things included things like physical and sexual abuse, neglect, different issues in the home around domestic violence, having a caregiver who was incarcerated, a caregiver with mental health concerns, or substance abuse. And it's important to note too, which we'll highlight more in a couple slides later on, that they didn't ask about every kind of adversity because this was the first study done in this area on this specific type of thing. And what the study found in terms of prevalence with those 17,000 participants were that 64% reported experiencing at least one of those adverse childhood experiences that they asked about. And you can see, especially, I want to highlight those lower two numbers with the 3 ACEs and the 4 or more, where 12.4% of individuals reported experiencing 4 or more of those adverse childhood experiences. And this chart here shows the breakdown of the 10 specific types of events that they asked about. You can see the full list there. So these were the 10 questions on that questionnaire that they asked if individuals had experienced in childhood. And you can see for that particular population, and again, this was done over 20 years ago, what some of the more prevalent ones were. The top 2, physical abuse and substance abuse in the home, both close to 30%. And there have been some more recent studies done that have looked, that have tried to include a larger and more diverse population in their sample, and have also tried to look at disparities that exist around ACE scores within income level and by race. And so this was a study done more recently that included about 214,000 people, so a larger sample. It was a little more diverse, but still not quite as diverse as probably many of us would have hoped they would have included. It was from individuals across 23 states, and still population more skewed towards higher income and white individuals. But you can see in this first slide showing ACE scores by income, higher ACE scores with those in the lower income brackets. And then looking by race as well, again, you can see some of the disparities there with the higher race scores by certain races again. And so the other piece of the original ACE study was, in addition to looking at prevalence, they also looked at later in life mental and physical health outcomes. And what they found were that ACEs can lead to some of the following things that you see listed here and in the chart here. So related to physical health, things like diabetes, obesity, stroke, cancer, heart disease, substance abuse, and then mental health, also substance abuse, depression, anxiety, suicide attempts. And one thing that we always like to highlight here with this slide, especially when we get to this point in the presentation, is no matter how many times, for those of you who are familiar with the ACE study and have seen these numbers before, and even for those of us that talk about it often, it still feels so heavy to see those numbers in print in front of you, and then to see a chart like this of what can be some of the outcomes for kids who are experiencing ACEs. And I'm sure for most of you, specific students, kids you love and have worked with, are coming to mind when you know what they might be experiencing outside of school. But what we want to share and what we want to emphasize, and where we're going to spend most of our time today, is on the fact that there is hope, and there are so many things that we can do as educators to help support kids so that this isn't their story. Just simple things like building secure and safe relationships, focusing on social emotional learning. And Shanda and Christy will give some more specifics and stories to those types of things, but all of those things help to create a different story for kids who we know are experiencing ACEs so that this isn't their outcome. This is a slide that we added in the past year that we came across that is pretty powerful in speaking to the things that were left out of that original ACE study. So you can see at the top around the tree are the individual and household level ACEs that were asked about in that first questionnaire. But underneath are what they're calling adverse community events, adverse community environments. So thinking about environmental, systemic, structural issues that so many of our kids and families are facing that weren't asked about in those original research studies that have a huge impact. And when we look at some of these things like poverty, discrimination, systemic racism, and community violence, we know that if those were asked about on different questionnaires, that the discrepancy by race and income level would be even greater. And this is an image that was created by an organization in California. It's called RISE, and they are a youth-led social justice organization. And they took the pyramid that's on the left of your screen that was originally created by the CDC based on that original ACE study and some of the outcomes and factors we just talked about, and added 2 layers to that pyramid that you can see underneath that blue layer, underneath adverse childhood experiences, that are so important to make sure that we're talking about. And one thing that our team really loves that's highlighted here at the top is where it says, if it's not racially just, it's not trauma informed. And the longer that we've been doing this work and having these conversations with schools at such a personal level, the more that our team has realized that in order to do the work of becoming trauma informed and focusing on resilience for our kids, we have to also have an equity lens and be having conversations around race. So the two have to go together. And I think the way this pyramid is structured that the RISE Center created there on the right really shows that. And a quote about how they created this pyramid and why they added those 2 layers says, I'm just going to read it, but it says, they also knew that there was more to a person's trauma than just his or her experiences. The youth come into this world in structures and conditions already established, and these structures are often punitive, things like zero tolerance policies in schools and embedded in racial bias. They limit opportunities and come with built-in economic and social inequities. And so again, those underneath layers that are often overlooked or we don't want to have conversations about or ask questions about, things like historical trauma, things like systemic racism and white supremacy. And we know more and more, especially in the current environment that we're living in, that we have to factor those in. We have to have conversations about them in order to fully think about trauma that so many kids and families are experiencing that we work with. And so to get into just briefly how we know all of this impacts our kids and our schools. Another common term for trauma or ACEs is toxic stress. And toxic stress is caused by prolonged or pronounced stress that overwhelms a child's skills and supports. And when this happens, this causes kids or adults to go into survival mode or for their stress response system to become activated. And when someone has a chronically activated stress response system, especially for kids whose brains are still in early development phases, this starts to alter the chemical and neurological events in their brain. And normally when we do this presentation, we spend more time talking about the brain science behind it. But here we really wanted to get to highlighting more of kind of the strategies in the process. So we're not going to dive deeper into that, but there is a lot of research that shows about the science behind how trauma impacts how kids' brains develop over time. So to really highlight how our stress response system works, I want everyone to take a quick second and think about this scene. Imagine that you're driving, you're really focused on what your to-do list as soon as you arrive at work, and suddenly a truck in front of you runs a stop sign and comes just inches from hitting you. You've got to slam on your brakes and swerve over to avoid hitting them. So think about the stress of that moment for a second. What does your mind do? Where do your thoughts go? How do you start to feel? What are your emotions in that moment? What does your body do in that moment? And if just 3 or 4 seconds later, someone came up to you and asked you what it was that you were thinking about, what was on your to-do list, how easy would it be for you to articulate and verbalize that back to them? So typically when we're doing this in person and can have more of a conversation with folks, people share things like their muscles get really tense, they grip the steering wheel really tight, their heart starts racing, they're breathing faster. They feel a rush of emotions like anger and fear and anxiety. And then it would be extremely difficult to articulate that to-do list or whatever it was that they were thinking about if someone came up to them right in that moment and asked them. So again, those verbal skills, those executive functions for higher thinking are all kind of taken away by the stress that's happening in that moment. So this is just one really small example of how kids and adults who are experiencing toxic stress may feel and may react to certain events repeatedly throughout a day. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with how our stress response system works in terms of the 3 typical responses to danger or threat with fight, flight, or freeze. And we've listed up here a few of the more common ways we know that oftentimes we see our students respond with their outward behavior in these 3 areas. But we want to highlight that in normal situations, having this response is a good thing. This is what keeps us safe, protects us when we are in danger or experiencing threat. But it's when someone starts experiencing toxic stress and this becomes their constant state of being, that it starts to interfere with everyday functioning, even when they're not in dangerous situations. So I want everyone to take a second too and think about all the different ways that your students may feel threatened that could activate their stress response system. It could be your students who you know are experiencing some of those ACEs at home. It could be students you know who are experiencing different types of discrimination and racism surrounding them, and how that makes them feel, the threats that presents to them, and then how that leads to this fight, flight, or freeze response for so many of our kids. So this slide we like to show too when we're talking about the brain and the stress response system and comparing how the brain works in a very similar way to Maslow's hierarchy. And so our stress response system is in the lower part of our brain. So when our stress response system is activated, we're just trying to feel safe, we're trying to protect ourselves. And that higher thinking part of our brain, that prefrontal cortex that has all those executive functions, is much harder to access and to use. And so that's again why we see a lot of kids struggling who we know are experiencing things outside and inside of school that have that stress response system being activated and aren't able to use different executive functions that are so critical for learning. So operating in a similar way to Maslow's hierarchy, where kids are just trying to get their basic needs to feel physically and emotionally safe in order to move up in the hierarchy. So how this impacts our students and our schools as a whole, this slide shows a number of the ways that we know kids are impacted. Things like higher absences, higher suspension rates, increased internalizing and externalizing behaviors, lower verbal skills, impaired memory. And one study found that kids with ACEs were up to 32 times more likely to be identified with learning and behavioral problems. So I know that was a lot of information really quickly, and again, was more focused on some of the research and a lot of the issues and the problems that we're facing. And we're going to shift now as I turn it over to Christy to talking more about what can we do and how can we create change.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here. I'm going to share a little bit about some experience I've had working on equity in a school under the Resilience and Learning Project. But as far as where do we start, as we move forward, we're just going to really build upon the mindset that Elizabeth mentioned earlier. If it's not racially just, it's not trauma informed. And we're going to look at specific strategies and examples that support both being resilient and having that equity lens. We always start with, this is a process, and the process really can't be stressed enough, especially in the context of equity. The disparities that we see, racism, institutional policies that shape what our system is, are longstanding. And so we really focus on the fact that it can't be changed overnight. We also take what we call a bottom-up approach, really focusing on the foundation and thinking back to that slide with the triangles with the issues of racism and white supremacy and all these things being under the layer, sort of the roots of the system. And so where do we start? We have to start there in order to be able to work up towards that resilience. One comparison that we do from bottom up is also with the brain in Maslow's hierarchy. And so we really focus on making sure that those essential needs are met at the base, the kind of reptilian brain, in order for learning to occur and us to get up to that prefrontal cortex and higher level of thinking. We also look at mindset. We consider the school culture and climate, realizing that teachers are really the true leaders in creating safe and supportive environments for students. And so first and foremost, teachers need to feel safe and supported. So a lot of times that's a starting place. Looking at comfort in the discomfort, T.S. Eliot says that only those who risk going too far can possibly find out how far they can go. Research tells us that discomfort engages many different parts of our brain, forcing us to consider different opinions and look at the problem from a different perspective, which is especially helpful when we're talking about things like racism and disparities that may exist in our actual building. Changing our lens, let's be honest, we would all love it if we had a crystal clear big picture view or a master plan of how to tackle these difficult issues. But unfortunately, it's kind of an unrealistic expectation when we're taking on new and challenging endeavors. So we need to continually ask the question, is this practice creating equity and building resilience at the same time? Leadership is incredibly important. Having a strong team, we have found that voluntary, wanting to be part of the team, really being passionate about leading the process and having a diverse team are the key components to really creating change within a school overall. And definitely data. I have found this particularly helpful when taking on difficult conversations about race and about equity because it's very factual. So it removes some of the blame and the shame around those conversations. So if we look at it as fact and then we move on to solutions and change, it becomes more of a positive than getting stuck in some of the bias and situations that we have ourselves in. Willingness to try and try and try and try again. Understanding that failure really is part of the process. None of us have any easy answers for systemic racism or bias, but we do know, like Elizabeth mentioned, ways to foster resilience. So really, we just have to be willing to take that first step. So last year, I had the extraordinary opportunity to work with Hannaford Dole through the Resilience and Learning Project, and the administration and resilience team decided to focus on equity, knowing basically that equity is the foundation for which relationships function, academic success, as well as directly kind of impacting discipline within the building. And I love this quote, and I will talk more about Dole as we go on. But Dr. Flood says, "Children are not what you think they are or what they think they are. They tend to become what they think you think they are." And I know it's a tongue twister, and it'll be on the slides so you can look back at it. But when we use the lens of equity, we need to continually self-examine our own beliefs and the tremendous impact that they have in shaping kids' lives. And so I love to always think back to that quote, because our beliefs really are forming children's beliefs about themselves. So being conscious about that. Next, we'll look at strategies to consider when we're looking to foster resilience with a school-wide focus on equity. And so wellness and training, these are some of the strategies that we used at Dole. I had never done a particular equity focus, so this was our first experience. It was a learning experience for everyone. We tried to be very patient and intentional about all the choices that we made. But a focus on staff wellness has always been paramount, but I think it's really becoming even more so during the pandemic. And so we're really going to have to think, I think, outside of the box and go even further to support staff during this time. Things like looking at compassion, fatigue, and burnout can be useful tools in order to better understand what supports are needed for teachers. Self-care and whole school initiatives can be a great way to promote and build up that whole feeling of well-being. Creating a safe place is really important for everyone. And again, with COVID, it's probably more important than ever and entails a lot more than what we used to talk about when creating safe places. But we look at physical safety, emotional safety, and academic safety. Self-compassion is a really great one, in my opinion. At Dole, we chose to start there, acknowledging that we all really need to provide ourselves with a little more grace and understanding, especially when we're talking about difficult issues. And we're often very critical of ourselves without even being aware of it. So when we do have discussions about racism or disparities that might exist in the building, if we don't have that self-compassion, we're not able to sort of step out of things and come up with solutions for those issues. There's tons of online resources about this, so I would encourage you to look it up. Book clubs are also a great way to start the conversation. We at Dole did team level clubs, and then everyone came together to discuss. And the reason we did that was for safety. Typically teams are tightly knit and know each other well, and it's a little easier to have some difficult discussions maybe in a smaller group and then come together with some takeaways. Relationships. So, we talked a lot, Elizabeth, about adversity, but that's really only one part of the equation. No one is magically resilient, just the same as no child is automatically doomed if they have experienced ACEs. And so we talk a lot in our work about protective factors, and they really help build resilience and sort of mitigate the consequences of the adversity. So research tells us that a safe and supportive relationship with a trusted adult is the #1 protective factor for kids who have experienced adversity. And this is really the good news. We all have the ability to foster those relationships and make a huge impact and provide that protective factor every day. Modeling positive skills. And I've got the sort of I've got your back mentality. Really, honestly, should be the school motto for both adults and kids, because this is hard work and it is a process and we all need that support. Many of our schools have chose adult relationships as their starting point. It's different for each school, But the bottom line is teachers need to feel that support before they can support our students. And so figuring out how we really foster that culture among the adults is really important. So as we kind of move into this uncharted territory of COVID, being thoughtful and intentional about the true effect that this is going to have on our interactions and relationships, and looking for ways to compensate, you know, that missing hug or not seeing a smile under a mask. We're all really wired for that connection. And so thinking, you know, how can we promote connection in spite of COVID during this time? These are some of the strategies that our schools have used to help promote that connection and build safe and supportive relationships. I would love to see your ideas maybe in the chat for building relationships during the pandemic. We're kind of all in this together, and I think we should share as much as we possibly can. And now I will hand it over to Shanda to further discuss discipline and dive into our state data on disparities.
Thank you, Christy. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? I'm using headphones. Okay, awesome. Good afternoon, everybody. We're gonna go ahead and talk a little bit about structure and expectations. And when working with schools who have committed to focusing on equity and resilience, we always encourage teams to explore the structures and expectations that they currently have and how those structures and expectations are communicated to students, number one, and more importantly, how these structures and expectations, and notice I'm using the word expectation and not rules, work to support student success. Whenever we go into buildings and start talking about trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed practices and resilience and ACEs, the first thing that staff sometimes want to believe about our work is that somehow you have to give way or get rid of all of your discipline protocols, that we throw all caution to the wind, no child gets punished for anything, and it's exactly the opposite. Students who come from chaotic situations need and want nothing more than structure, routine, and clear expectations. So in working with our teams, and if you are thinking about doing this work in your school, some of the areas that you can start to look at are the physical space in your schools. How is your daily schedule and routine setting students up for success? And are they equitable? Are they things that all students can access and perform regularly at the quality that all teachers would like to see in the building? Looking at transition times. Of course, this year we know we need to start talking about what the new normal and if any of our expectations will change. And last but not least, we always start looking at discipline. And I will note that, as Christy said in the beginning, when you start talking about discipline practices, equity and racial equity in those practices, and bias that runs throughout our discipline practices in the building, it's best to start with the data. We all have an inkling or an idea of what we think our school needs, but starting and beginning with data helps drive that conversation so that no one feels attacked and we take away the shame. So I want to share with you a couple of slides that have some of our state data up here that kind of talks as to why discipline is such a big deal. Of course, we know that if a school does not have structure, expectations, and good discipline practices, that we really can't get the academic work done. But if you look in this particular slide, it shows the percent of short-term suspensions by race. And in order to kind of give it some perspective, on the right side of your screen, you'll see the percent of students by race. And what you can see through this chart is that Black and American Indian students are heavily overrepresented when it comes to exclusionary discipline practices such as short-term suspension rates. And we have our Asian and white students who are grossly underrepresented. And so, of course, we could have some conversations, and it will vary by building, but some of these systemic things we need to start looking at and understand that implicit bias does play a part in how we handle discipline within our school buildings. The next slide addresses specifically school-based juvenile complaints to law enforcement and juvenile court. And again, you can see the same kind of comparison with the percent of students by race and the percent of students in the district by race. And what you see here is that, once again, Black students are overrepresented when it comes to complaints being made to juvenile justice and or law enforcement. What this shows here and what this contributes to is the school to prison pipeline. And so one of the things we need to start talking about, and I know we all get tired or emotionally drained with this conversation about discipline, but I do know of a lot of districts that we work with and districts in the state that are looking to change their student code of conduct and how they handle discipline for this exact reason. The school to prison pipeline is real, and studies show that once students are involved in the court system, they're likely to reoffend and they're likely to maintain a lifetime entanglement in the criminal justice system. We also need to think about, data also shows us, that our exclusionary discipline practices dating back to pre-K have an impact on student success. And as you can see in this slide, each suspension decreases a student's odds of graduating high school by additional 20% and decreases their odds of enrolling in post-secondary school by 12%. And that's staggering. So when a child starts being suspended in pre-K or kindergarten or first grade, each time that child is put out of the learning environment, we are actively decreasing that child's chances of graduating from high school and decreasing their access to post-secondary opportunities. That's huge. That fact alone should make us stop every time we see a referral, every time we write a referral, and want action taken to think about what it is that this child needs. That comes back to that conversation of equity. What does this child need to persist and be successful in this learning environment? The learning environment in which we write the rules, right? Those structures and expectations are all things that the adults in the building have put in place. How are they serving our children? Suspensions have also been found to do very little to improve student behavior and actually can have the opposite impact on students, creating negative behaviors and more negative emotions for the child. And more recently, Perry and Morris found that schools with higher suspension rates were more likely to hinder academic growth and reduce student achievement, even for those not actually suspended. So every discipline measure that we take, every way that we handle discipline has an impact not only on that child, but also has an impact on the culture that we're creating in schools. And I love Bill Daggett, used to go to all of his conferences whenever I could, and he always talked about culture trumps strategy. You have to put the culture in place that you want in order for any of the strategies that you want to implement to work. And I can speak to this as being a high school principal in a high school that had a very high suspension rate, one of the highest suspension rates in the state. And one of the things that we found was at the time that we had the highest suspension rates in the state, we also had some of the lowest performance scores in the state as well. And the more that we started to work on how we were going to deal with discipline, how were we going to encourage students to want to be in the building, to want to be part of the learning environment, it changed things for those kids who were on the outside looking in. It lessened the chaos, and it actually increased proficiency and increased growth for us while we brought down our suspension rate, and we're able to have students remain in the building. And I know some of you are like, well, what did you do? Well, we'll talk about that in just a second, but one of the things that our program leans heavily on and believes in is restorative practices for those students. Just like that second bullet point states, just because you send students outside of the learning environment, it changes nothing. Either they're disenfranchised with the building and with the people in the building who put them out of the community, excuse me, or they become more or less sympathetic to what it is that you're trying to do in the building. And then for a lot of students, everybody didn't grow up in a middle class household that has somebody at home saying, hey, if you get suspended, you know, you're going to face trouble at home as well, so you better stay in school. A lot of our kids don't come from that. So a suspension is just another way of excluding them from the communities that they feel safe in. So again, I'll go back to some data. How does this all tie together? Well, it's structural inequities in our school, right? In our school systems. And sometimes those expectations and structures that we put in place to help support and maintain external control have lasting negative impacts on those students. So think back to your high flyers, especially for those of you who are in elementary situations. If you think about those high flyer babies, and I know a lot of us have tried a continuum of supports as it relates to discipline for our students, because we know we want to promote resilience and overcome those ACEs that they experience. But every time we exclude them from the learning environment, remember that statistic, 20% chance that they won't, or they won't graduate from high school, that they'll drop out. We see the evidence right here. So those two charts I showed you before showed how our brown students were impacted in North Carolina by exclusionary discipline. Well, look here at this chart with North Carolina graduation rates. You see again here that brown students graduation percentage is less than that of their white counterparts, and even less of that of the overall graduation rate in the state. That's huge. So every decision that we make, and I know I'm kind of making this a big deal, but every decision that we make with each student has lasting impacts. Not only does it affect graduation rates, but it also affects their access to other educational opportunities. If you look here, this is course participation by race and ethnicity in AP courses in North Carolina. So I challenge you to look at the light purple, which shows the total NC student population. And then you can see the proportion, of all AP courses taken and proportion of students taking at least one AP course. Again, our brown students are underrepresented in these numbers. Implicit bias, our expectations and our ideas and thoughts on how well certain race groups meet our expectations play a role in who gets recommended for these courses. And we see this clearly. So going back to what Christy said, starting with the data helps to smooth out and start us on a level playing field when we start talking about things such as this. And I can say, let me go to the next slide and then I'll share with you. It also impacts the overall academic achievement, right? Because for those of you who are in the high school level, you know, in your 11th grade year, students take that ACT test and you need a 17 composite score in order to gain acceptance into a UNC system school. Well, if you can see here, our brown students, once again, even our highest level, if you look at the Hispanic Latino number, which is 40%, that achieve that 17 composite score, that's still 30% less than their white counterparts. And it goes down from there. So all of these practices that we have of removing students from the classroom, number one, contributes to some of the trauma or that toxic stress that Elizabeth talked about. Number two, we're not teaching them, actively teaching them how to be resilient, how to bounce back, and we're excluding them from academic opportunities that can help them get out of the situations that they are in and access post-secondary education opportunities. So how do we change and start reducing the number of these disparities and long-term negative outcomes? Well, it goes back to what Christy said about the mindset shift for the adults in the building. Every time we've gone into a school, we start with the adults, because if we don't have buy-in and if we don't start talking to the adults about what our current beliefs are and where we want to go and how we're going to get there, no strategy that we put in place will be implemented with fidelity, number one, or will it become systemic to the point that it can survive once we have left the building and we're not actively coaching in that building. So some of the things that we really focus on and we do is setting clear expectations and ensuring all students have the skills to meet expectations. You may or may not be surprised that a lot of times you can walk into a classroom and the expectations are on the wall, the teacher repeats them 100 times. You know, one of my favorite in the elementary school is sit crisscross applesauce. So the kids know what that looks like, and most of them can get on the carpet and sit crisscross applesauce. However, there are other expectations that are not as explicit in the classroom that we really need to make sure that we're modeling to students how to do that and what it is that we expect. One of the things I'll share, like I said, I've had the privilege of working in Eastern North Carolina in some of the toughest schools, but some of the most rewarding. And as a principal, I remember people always wanting to come into my building to support my students, provide programming, assemblies, those kinds of things. And it was terrifying to me to have others in my building because my kids knew not how to act once we got into the auditorium setting. But what I started to realize is, well, when have I ever taught them how to behave when they were in front of a guest speaker? And I realized that they didn't know. Where were the kids in my community ever given the opportunity to go and listen to a professional give advice, give a speech, tell a story? Very few of them had that opportunity. So we began to teach them what those expectations look like and model them for them and remind them in the moment of what is expected of them. And needless to say, eventually I started letting more and more people in my building, and my students benefited from the experience. I was holding them accountable for something that they had not been taught or given the necessary skills to do. Consistency, when talking about consistency within trauma-informed practices, it's important to remember that consistency does not mean the same. Consistency means that you will be consistent in addressing the issue, but when we're talking through or looking through a lens of equity, the consequences cannot be the same. The way that we handle students, the way we handle student academic performance, student behavior performance cannot be the same for every student. And that's hard for us as educators sometimes to break out of. We have our discipline matrix. We know if Johnny does this, then Johnny gets that. And we keep following that even to Johnny's detriment, because Johnny doesn't change, nor does Johnny learn the lesson of what we want Johnny to learn. And so consistency means consistently addressing the problem, but consistency does not have to mean same. And we talk about understanding how trauma symptoms and cultural bias impact discipline disparities. We consider alternatives to suspension, such as restorative practices, and creating a continuum of interventions, if you will, of what we can do when a student violates expectations in the classroom. So we should have a list of strategies, and a lot of us do. If you think of your MTSS triangle, what's in that MTSS support triangle that will help you with that student in order to encourage them to stay in the learning environment? It should not be violate expectation, send out of the classroom. So we like to work with teams on what does that continuum look like? Do we provide a calm down corner or a calming strategy for students? Do we give them the opportunity for reflection, breathing exercises, bounce to a buddy? So working on those types of practices with teachers and administrators. Punishment versus consequences, and we'll get to that slide in just a second. And also, we talk a lot about subjective interpretations of behavior, things like disrespect, versus more objective behaviors, such as like drug use or fighting. And when you look at the discipline, or when you look at the data sets, we find that subjective interpretations of offenses, like what is disrespect, right? Black and brown students are disproportionately represented in those numbers versus in more objective numbers where it's fighting or having a weapon on campus or drug use. So we really have to get to how do our biases play a part in what is happening in our building. And I'll be totally transparent with you. As an administrator, both as assistant principal and principal, I can specifically see times in which I was walking in the hallway and it became second nature to allow white students to walk past me without a pass in the hallway. Whereas right around the corner, I'd see a Black or brown student and I give them the third degree. Where are you going? Why don't you have a pass? Reprimand the student. The next time I'm writing you up. And that became a habit for me, and a bias that I guess I assumed for whatever reason, that the white student had a valid reason for not getting a pass, or the white student knew if they were in the hallway without a pass, it had to be a good reason. But with some of my brown kids, surely they were trying to get over on the system. Surely somebody didn't know where they were. And that was hard for me. And as you guys can see me, that was hard for me as a Black woman and a Black administrator who was trying to help these students realize, hey, you do it too. So this isn't about blame and shame, as Christy said, but just all of us kind of looking at our patterns and our life experiences and how does that play out and how we deal with our students. So one of the things that we suggest is when you're beginning this conversation or when you come back to school, it may be a great idea to spend 20 or 30 minutes to set up an activity or protocol, and we would be happy. And if you guys know a way to do this, please share it in the chat, or if you've ever had this conversation with your staff. Talking about our traditional view of behavior versus a trauma-informed view. A traditional view of behavior really looks at students needing to be punished. And we've all been there when we're in the heat of the moment and we just need this referral to be handled and dealt with and something done to this student, versus a trauma-informed view, which looks at not only what is the appropriate consequences, but what is happening with that student. Are they having difficulty regulating their emotions? Are they trying to gain safety or get a reaction or support from an adult in the building? What needs do they have that need to be met? And work on not only what the consequence for the action is, but how do we give them the needed skills and support to meet our expectations on a daily basis? Another, in that same conversation, we were starting to talk about mindset shifts in our view of discipline. Moving from an idea of punishment, where we are trying to exert external control, keep control of our building, keep control of our classrooms, to a lens or a view of consequences, where our whole process behind figuring out what to do with that student or for that student is to teach internal control. And as you see on the second line of these, under punishment, it's very reactive. Again, we've all been there, we all do it, but we want to move from being reactive to very planned and purposeful in what kind of consequences that we give to the student, because ultimately we want that student to be able to self-regulate, gain internal control of what's happening with them, and also be able to meet the expectations in the building to gain those skills. So if you look at the bottom, it says we're moving from retribution to restitution. And that's the whole framework behind restorative practices. And so just to wrap up here, and give you a quick example of Elizabeth City Pasquotank Public Schools. I'll shout them out. I'm blessed, all the districts that I work in, shout out to Nash, Rocky Mount as well, and Pitt. And, but Elizabeth City Schools was able to put a restorative coach in all of their buildings to help begin this process. And some of the work that P.W. Moore Elementary School did was very impactful on how they were able to start shifting mindsets with the adults. One thing they did was a check-in, much like we did at the beginning of this. We do check-ins at faculty and staff meetings. You also do check-ins every morning with each student, because if you know that the students come in dysregulated, you can kind of help support them. Well, you can help support them throughout their day so that they don't end up violating expectations and being sent out of the classroom. And Elizabeth City Middle School have done some great work in this. They have transformed their ISS room. They don't even have ISS anymore. They do restorative circles in the morning for students who have been assigned to ISS. They call it REST. They do circles to restore, get the student all the skills that they need to start the day off right, and put those students back in the classroom so that they can practice those skills in the real environment. It's one thing to talk about what it is you need to do. It's another to be given the opportunity to practice with support. And so now that we're not in school and the school year ended abruptly, Elizabeth City Middle School has embedded an SEL time into their summer school, virtual summer school program, and it's going very well. We're very excited and happy about that. I will tell you that some of the same students who have discipline problems in the classroom have discipline problems during virtual learning. However, we really talked about how do you encourage, redirect, and support and lift those students up virtually instead of outing them outside the classroom, or excuse me, outside of the Zoom call, turning their camera off, those kinds of things. So those are things that you might want to start thinking about as we move into an online learning environment. How do we still support kids who don't meet our expectations and give them the skills to meet our expectations? Last thing, we're talking about, our last thing we talk about is social emotional learning and teaching those skills, just like the example that I gave with Elizabeth City Middle School. We need to teach those just like we do any academic content. You telling a student to calm down doesn't help the student calm down. They have to be given the skills that they need to regulate themselves, to manage their thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. Some ideas for this, for those of you who are out there, curriculum such as Second Step, which can be kind of costly, but there's also Sanford Harmony and Choose Love, which we're using at Elizabeth City Middle School this summer, which are free resources. Mindfulness or brain breaks with tools like Mind Yeti, thinking about ways that we can teach parents and students to create calm down spaces and calming corners in their homes and in their own bedrooms, and making sure that we embed SEL strategies into MTSS. How do we teach students those skills that they need to be successful and resilient in the classroom? So if in the chat you could, as we begin to wrap up, tell us how you've continued to implement SEL virtually, if you have, if anything was working and worked well, and what has been a challenge or a success that you've experienced thus far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanda. And I have to say that I feel like at the beginning of this, we said, when you think of it, add a policy recommendation into the chat, because you all have actually mentioned every single one of the policy recommendations that we have here, which are built from all of the different work that we've done with schools and looking at the research. And so you are experts as well. So just quickly, our policy recommendations are about funding, but also making sure that our educators have access to professional learning on anti-racism, trauma, and restorative practices. And it needs to be meaningful and ongoing and with support. And we know that. We also know that increasing mental health support staff is critical for our students when you look at the ACEs data and how that can impact them in the immediate, but also long term. We also want to make sure that we're prioritizing strategies that minimize exclusionary discipline practices. And I'm seeing a lot of work being done on codes of conduct and different kinds of practices. And I do think they can go a very long way in supporting us. And lastly, increasing teacher diversity is actually very important. I'm going to pause for a moment because Blake is going to go ahead and also put the survey in the chat for you to complete. But I did want, if Elizabeth doesn't mind, just to share a couple more data points with you, because you do seem like a group that really appreciates having these excellent resources. So one of the things we know is that these racial inequities in our schools do have a deep impact on our students. And research shows that when teacher race matches student race, for students of color, there is less implicit bias, there's reduced discipline disparities, there's higher achievement, and many other positives. And what's interesting is we also see that teachers of color are beneficial for our white students as well. And so this is just such an important aspect of the work. And then we also wanted to share with you just what does the picture look like in terms of counselors, social workers, psychologists, nurses, law enforcement, and safety guards. And you can see on the right, these are the recommended numbers that we think schools should have compared to our North Carolina numbers in that middle column. So it has our total number of counselors, but also the ratio. And you can see that almost across the board, we need more of counselors, we need more social workers, and we certainly need more nurses in our schools. And so this really does help us as we're making the case for what we need and the policy recommendations that we have. I'm so appreciative of all the tremendous work and examples that you all have been sharing, and for the work of this team that has brought us to this point. We did want to let you know we've loved partnering here with the Friday Institute for the Equity Conference and being able to be part of this. But we also know that in working with them, we made sure, they said, let's make sure they know about the color of education. And those of you that may have joined us last year, we will once again be hosting Color of Education, but instead of one day, it's going to be a Color of Education month. So in October, we will have weekly virtual series. And looking at the chat here, I know that many of you would love to continue those discussions, and we will have that opportunity. So on behalf of the Public School Forum and this awesome resilience and learning team that you got to hear from today, thank you so much for joining us. And Blake, thank you to the Friday Institute for having us and for letting us share this work.
Thank you. And again, we put the session evaluation in the chat. Feedback would be greatly appreciated. And also if you want the certificate. So thank you so much, all of you, for presenting. This is incredible.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.